This is Steincamp from the Chess Summit Network, and I'm back with another video. For today's video, I wanted to go a little bit off the beaten path, and rather than do game analysis, I wanted to present two tactical puzzles, which I feel like for anyone in that 1,000 to 2,000 rating range, this is probably worth a good think. If you're watching this video and you're trying to do some tactics, I'd recommend setting up these positions on the board, and then pausing the videos before I give the answers and trying to solve them as you go along. This first puzzle I'll present is more of a maneuvering kind of puzzle, and the second puzzle I will present is a very tactical, calculation-based puzzle. So they both have strengths for different kinds of players. Okay, so for this first game, I played in the 2013 Fairfax Open in December last year, and I'm with the black pieces. It's black to move and win. What do you think? Okay, well, if you haven't solved it yet, pause your video. That's perfectly fine. But I'm going to go ahead and proceed. So, if you'll notice in this position, white has really strong control over the dark squares, so it's important that I play on the light squares. So, the first move is kind of intuitive. It's queen to h1 check. I'm forking both the pawn and the king. Notice how I'm up a pawn, so being up two pawns, I'm probably going to have a one endgame, even if it's queen and knight versus queen and bishop. So, my opponent played queen to g1. Natural move. If I take bishop takes g1, it's probably not winnable. So it's critical that I do not trade queens, but instead I played queen to f3 check, queen to f2, queen to d1. This looks kind of similar to the position we started with if I just played queen d1. But here's the critical difference. My opponent's queen is on f2, which takes away a critical square from my opponent's king, which puts him on a light square. And remember, I want to play on the light squares. Now, before I make the move my opponent made, which is king g2, let's take a quick look at queen to e1. So my opponent plays queen to e1. You may have seen this. Queen takes e1 check, king takes e1, knight d3 check, and the game is over. Losing the bishop is fatal, and there's no way to, no way for even white to hope for a draw. So he cannot play queen to e1. So he plays king to g2, play queen to d5, check, putting pressure on the bishop while checking the king. My opponent plays king f1, and now here is the critical position. If in this position you thought knight d3 was the winning move, you are incorrect, believe it or not. Actually, the move knight d3 might not even guarantee any advantage after this move, queen to d4. If I play queen takes bishop, he's going to play queen takes knight, and now it's a queen on queen ending, and even though I'm up a pawn, it's not guaranteed that I can win this endgame. In fact, I'm probably guaranteed a draw now. So, knight d3 is the wrong move. You have to make one in-between move. Remember, you want this queen to also be attacking this bishop, so when you make this fork, you do win the piece. So that being said, the only move that works here is queen to c4 check. Now, when my opponent plays king to g2, this move, knight d3 check, knight d3 rather, just wins the game. My opponent played queen to f1, with the idea that if I play knight takes bishop, then he takes my queen for free. But I don't think so. Queen to c2, king to h3, and I just pick up the bishop, and the game is over. That was a very fun tactic to find on the board, but it wasn't that hard to find, even though from this position, it's hard to believe that you can actually win the bishop. But if you play off the light squares and you force the king to stay on the light squares, you'll create all sorts of opportunities in these positions. Imagine if we were playing like an opposite colored bishop middle game. You always attack on the diagonals that are opposite to the color of your opponent's bishop, because theoretically that means one fewer protector. That's the exact same case here. This bishop can never guard a light square, so play on the light squares. That's the moral of the story. Okay, this next puzzle comes from one of my earlier rounds from the Eastern Open of 2013 in Bethesda, Maryland. And we'll go through the opening really quick. We reached an interesting game. I got an early f4 push. I don't really think it mounted to anything, though. I would have probably played it differently if I were to play it now. But got a very active position. And my opponent started making critical mistakes here. Okay, he played b3 after thinking for about 20 minutes, and kind of realized he was very passive. So I had to be active in order to get any sort of compensation. So I played bishop to e5. Everything's pointing at the king's side. My opponent plays rook to f1, offering to trade rooks. If I trade the rooks, the game's probably a draw. And my opponent's been playing for the draw for the last couple of moves now. So it's black to move. How do you keep the advantage? Okay, well, if you haven't solved it yet, that's perfectly fine. It took me about 15 minutes in the tournament to find this move too, so feel free to definitely pause the video because this one's going to take a lot of work to be able to get it 100% right. So, if you're looking for your forcing moves, the first forcing move you find, bishop takes g3 check, is actually the best move. White can't take the bishop, and we're going to go over why in a second, because in the game he played king takes g3. If he had played king h1 or king g1, that's the end of the variation, but I go up a pawn. And, you know, a pawn, after all, is a pawn, so I'm perfectly okay with this. He played king takes g3. This is where doing your homework comes in. So, I like my rook on the f-file because it stops the king from cutting over, you know, to maybe e1 or d1. But I don't want the king to go back into this hole, into h2. So it's very critical that I block this square. So I played queen to e5 check. So my opponent has to bring his king out now. Obviously, rook f4 is met by queen takes f4 checkmate, so what can he do, right? So my opponent plays king to h4. Let's say for a second he plays king to g4. You may have looked at this line. The same idea for king h4 does not work for king g4, but there's an easy win here, and the answer is queen h5 check. To king g3, you can just pick up the queen, give him the rook, and there's plenty of compensation here for black. I believe here I can just bring in the knight, maybe like knight to e5, and this knight is it's hanging. So I was very happy if you were to have chosen that, but that's not what happened in the game. He played king to h4. So when you're looking for forcing moves, you also want to realize that you're trying to create a box for your opponent here. So this rook, you know, ideally is stopping the king from ever crossing over this way, and this queen is stopping the king from ever coming over, you know, the h2 to b8 diagonal. So it's important to bring in my other pieces. My knight can't give a forcing move, so my only other option here is g5. He plays king to h5. Let's say if he plays king to g4. Here I have rook to f4 check. And if he plays rook takes f4, queen takes f4, king h5, queen h4 is checkmate. That's very happy. So I was fine with this. And if he plays king to g3, I could take on f1 with check. Game is over. If he plays king h5, you know, I still just look for forcing moves. Rook h4 is checkmate. So the game's over. So in all of these lines with king g4, the game is over. Okay. So he plays king to h5, the best move. And again, I have to still look for all these critical checks. So I played queen to e8 check. My opponent took on g5. Let's say for a second he played king to g4. This is the line I had analyzed during the game. And I thought that this might have been my opponent's best chance, but I found the following line in the game. h5 check, king takes, rook g8. If king f4, black meets it with queen e5 checkmate, so the only move that doesn't lose immediately is king h4. But then I have the sneaky move, queen e7 check. Now, white has to make computer moves. So, rook f6, queen takes f6, king takes h5, queen to g5 is checkmate. So this is not a viable option. So, the game, my opponent took on g5, and now, this is also a very critical position. How do you deliver check? If you thought queen g6 check was the right move here, after a move like king h4, it's not quite clear how I bring in that second attacking piece. Queen h6 is met by king g3, and there's no way to stop the king from going back to h2, so that actually probably loses in the long term. So you have to be very precise. You have to keep in mind that white wants to trade the rooks. If you can trade the rooks, the game is over, black loses. So you need to get rid of that threat with a forcing move. The only way to do that, effectively, is rook to g8 check. Now my opponent has two choices, king h4 and king f4, but ultimately they end up the same way. My opponent played king f4, and now it's just a simple mate in two. Queen to e5 check, king to f3, queen to g3 checkmate. Wasn't that awesome? So notice how I went through that process systematically. I just looked for forcing moves that improved my position, and I was able to piece it together at the board to find that the bishop takes g3 works, because if he takes the bishop, then I'm much better. So there you go. That was one maneuvering tactic and one calculation tactic, and I hope you enjoyed both of them, and I hope you enjoyed this video. This is Isaac Steincamp signing off for the Chess Summit Network. Thank you.